Finally, she is gone. Those 4 words came through the baby monitor and made my entire world stop. I stood in the hallway of my own home, holding my code in my hands, unable to move. For a moment, I wondered if I had heard correctly. I had only been gone for 20 minutes. I had only pretended to leave. I had only wanted to see if my husband would notice my absence. I never expected to hear a sentence that would change the way I looked at my entire marriage. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I was 66 years old when I discovered that the person I trusted most had been keeping parts of his life hidden from me. That evening began like any ordinary day. I told my husband Thomas that I was going to spend a few days with my sister in Pennsylvania. I packed a small overnight bag, kissed him goodbye, and watched him wave from the front porch. He looked completely normal, calm, relaxed, almost relieved. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that after 35 years of marriage, people naturally changed. I told myself that quiet moments did not always mean something was wrong. But deep down, I had been feeling a distance between us for months. Not the kind of distance you can see from across a room. The kind you feel when someone who used to share everything with you starts keeping parts of themselves somewhere you cannot reach. I drove around the corner, parked near an old community center, and waited. I did not know exactly what I was hoping to discover. Maybe I wanted proof that I was overthinking. Maybe I wanted to return home and laugh at myself for being suspicious. After nearly 40 minutes, I realized I had left my favorite scarf on the chair in the living room. It was a small thing, but I decided to go back. When I entered the house quietly, I noticed something unusual. The television was off. The kitchen was silent. The whole house felt different. I walked toward the living room to find my scarf, and that was when I saw the baby monitor on the shelf. We had kept it from years ago when our grandchildren stayed with us. It was old, but it still worked. I remembered leaving it there because I liked hearing the familiar sounds of the house when I was in another room. I never imagined that one day I would hear something through it that I was never meant to hear. The small screen was glowing. I pressed the button without thinking. At first, there was only silence. Then I heard Thomas's voice. Finally, she is gone. Now we can talk freely. My hand froze. I stood completely still, listening. I did not want to believe what I was hearing. The man speaking sounded like my husband, but the words belonged to someone I did not recognize. For 35 years, I believed Thomas and I were a team. We built our home together. We raised our family together. We faced difficult seasons together. I knew his habits, his expressions, and even the way he sighed when he was tired. But standing there in my own living room, I realized there was something about him I did not know. I heard another voice respond, but I could not focus on anything except those first words. Finally, she is gone. Not, I hope she is okay. Not, I wonder when she will be back. Gone. As if my presence had become something to escape. I turned off the monitor and slowly placed it back on the shelf. I did not cry. I did not call his name. I did not walk into the room and demand answers. Something inside me knew that the first reaction was not always the wisest one. So I picked up my scarf, walked quietly to the front door, and left the house again. But this time, I was not leaving to test my husband. I was leaving because I needed to understand the truth. And for the first time in 35 years, I wondered if the life I thought I knew was only part of the story. After I drove away from my house for the second time that evening, I did not know where I was going. I simply followed the road and allowed the quiet of the night to surround me. The familiar streets of my neighborhood passed by the windows of my car, but everything looked different. The same houses, the same trees, the same peaceful streets I had known for years. Yet somehow, I felt like I was seeing my own life from the outside. I eventually parked near a small park where Thomas and I used to walk together on Sunday mornings. I sat there for almost an hour, holding my hands around a cup of coffee I had bought from a nearby shop, trying to understand what I had heard. The hardest part was not the words themselves. It was the feeling that came after them. The feeling that maybe I had been the only person protecting the image of our perfect marriage. For 35 years, I believed Thomas was the person who knew me better than anyone else. We met when we were both young, when neither of us had much. We built our first home with patience and hard work. I still remembered the day we received the keys to our first house. Thomas smiled and said, "We are going to create something beautiful here." And we did. We filled that home with ordinary moments that became precious memories. Sunday dinners, birthday celebrations, quiet evenings sitting together after a long day. I never needed a perfect life. I only wanted a life where two people continued choosing each other. As the years passed, I became the person who carried most of the little responsibilities. I remembered appointments. I organized family gatherings. I kept track of important dates. I made sure everyone felt cared for. That was simply who I was. I never saw those things as sacrifices. They were acts of love. But over the past year, I had started noticing changes in Thomas. They were small at first. He would take phone calls outside instead of answering them in front of me. He would turn his screen away when messages appeared. He seemed distracted during conversations that used to matter to both of us. When I asked if something was wrong, he always gave the same answer. "Everything is fine, Margaret. You worry too much." I wanted to believe him. I truly did, because after decades together, the idea that something was wrong felt almost impossible to accept. It was easier to believe I was imagining things than to believe the person beside me had created a world I was not part of. But that night changed everything. The baby monitor did not just reveal words. It revealed a feeling I had been trying to ignore. I had felt like a stranger in my own marriage before I ever heard that conversation. The conversation only confirmed what my heart had already noticed. When I finally returned home later that night, I did not wake Thomas. I quietly walked into the bedroom and placed my bag on the chair. I looked at him sleeping peacefully, and for a moment, I remembered the man I had loved for all those years. That was the hardest part. Betrayal is not painful because you stop caring. It is painful because you still remember all the reasons you cared in the first place. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I made coffee as I always did. I opened the curtains. I watered the flowers outside. Everything looked normal, but I was not the same person who had gone to bed the night before. I had questions now. I had doubts. And most importantly, I had finally stopped ignoring the small signs I had been explaining away for too long. I did not know what Thomas had been hiding. I did not know who he was talking to or what he truly meant. But I knew one thing. I could no longer live inside a story that someone else had written for me. The days after that evening felt strangely normal. That was the part that confused me the most. The world around me continued moving as if nothing had changed. The neighbors walked their dogs. The mail arrived every afternoon. The flowers in my garden continued blooming as they always had. But inside my own home, I felt like I was quietly watching a life that no longer belonged completely to me. I did not confront Thomas. Not yet. I knew that if I walked into that conversation with only emotions, I might never learn the full truth. After 35 years of marriage, I had learned something important. People often reveal more when they believe they're not being questioned. So I waited. I listened. I observed. I started noticing the small things I had ignored before. Thomas had always been a routine person. He liked his morning coffee at exactly the same time. He read the newspaper in the same chair every weekend. He kept his keys in the same place near the front door. Those familiar habits were part of the man I knew, but recently, new habits had appeared. He started taking longer phone calls in the garage. He would step outside whenever certain messages came through. He became protective of simple conversations that never used to be private. I did not accuse him. I simply noticed. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the bedroom when I heard Thomas talking on the phone downstairs. The sound was quiet, and I could not make out every word, but I heard enough to know he was discussing something important. When I walked into the room, he immediately changed the subject. "Just work stuff," he said. I smiled politely and continued folding the towels. But inside, I felt that familiar feeling again. The feeling that there were pieces of a puzzle missing. Later that evening, I sat at my desk and looked through old photographs. I found pictures from our anniversary trips, family holidays, and simple weekends at home. In every picture, Thomas and I looked happy, and maybe we were. That was the confusing part. Not every moment had been fake. Not every memory had been a lie. There had been real love between us. Real laughter. Real years of choosing each other. But sometimes people change quietly, and the person standing beside you becomes someone you have to learn again. The next morning, I called my longtime friend Susan Miller. Susan had known me for more than 20 years. She was the kind of friend who did not rush to give advice. She listened first. When she arrived, we sat at my kitchen table with coffee between us. I told her about the baby monitor. I told her about Thomas's words. I told her about the changes I had noticed. Susan did not interrupt. She simply looked at me and said, "Margaret, what worries me is not only what you heard, it is how long you have been feeling alone before you heard it." Those words stayed with me, because she was right. The monitor had revealed a conversation, but my heart had been noticing the distance for much longer. I spent years believing that a strong marriage meant understanding someone even when they became difficult to understand. I believed patience could solve almost anything. But Susan reminded me that patience should not require a person to disappear inside their own relationship. That night, I made a decision. I would not rush into accusations. I would not create a scene. I would find clarity. I would understand what Thomas had been hiding and why. For the first time in many years, I stopped asking myself how I could save my marriage. Instead, I started asking a different question. Was my marriage still something both of us were trying to save? The next few days became a quiet search for answers. I did not wake up each morning planning to discover something painful. I woke up hoping I would find a simple explanation. Maybe there was something I misunderstood. Maybe there was a reason behind Thomas's behavior that I had not considered. After 35 years together, I wanted to believe that there was still a part of him that would choose honesty if given the chance. But trust is a delicate thing. Once you notice cracks, you start seeing details you once overlooked. I began paying attention to the moments that used to pass without question. One afternoon, Thomas received a phone call while we were sitting in the living room. He looked at the screen, stood up, and walked toward the hallway. It was a small action, something anyone could dismiss. But I remembered all the other times it had happened. The private conversations, the sudden changes in his mood, the way he seemed physically present but emotionally somewhere else. When he returned, I asked casually, "Everything okay?" He smiled and said, "Of course, nothing to worry about." I nodded, but I no longer felt comforted by those words. For years, those words would have been enough. I trusted Thomas completely, but now I understood that reassurance without honesty could leave a person feeling even more alone. That weekend, I decided to look through old family records and documents. Not because I wanted to invade Thomas's privacy. I was not searching for something to use against him. I was trying to understand the life we had built together and whether I was still standing on the same foundation. I opened the small cabinet in my home office where I kept important papers. There were old insurance documents, family records, and letters from years ago. As I looked through them, I felt a strange sadness. Not because of the papers themselves, because I realized how much of our life I had carefully preserved while Thomas seemed to be creating a separate world I knew nothing about. Later that evening, Susan called to check on me. She always seemed to know when I needed someone to talk to. I told her I still had no answers. I told her I was afraid of what I might discover. Susan said something that stayed with me. "Margaret, sometimes we are afraid of the truth because we think it will destroy us. But sometimes the truth is what finally allows us to stop pretending." I sat quietly after that. Stop pretending. Those words were difficult because I realized I had been pretending too. I had been pretending the distance between Thomas and me was just a phase. I had been pretending that a few changes did not matter. I had been pretending that love alone could fix everything. The following morning, I noticed Thomas leaving the house earlier than usual. He told me he had errands to run. I simply smiled and said goodbye. But this time, I did not feel the same sadness I had felt before. I felt clarity. I was no longer waiting for him to explain my own life to me. I was beginning to understand that I had the right to seek answers for myself. That afternoon, I returned to the old baby monitor in the living room. I looked at it sitting quietly on the shelf. It was just a small device from another time in our family's life. But now it represented something much bigger. It reminded me of the moment when I stopped ignoring my instincts. I knew I could not spend the rest of my life wondering what Thomas meant or why he said those words. I needed to know the full truth. Not because I wanted to punish him, not because I wanted revenge, but because after a lifetime of giving my heart to someone else, I finally owed myself honesty. The following morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. It was not because the situation had become easier. It had not. I still carried questions that I could not answer. I still looked at Thomas and wondered how much of his recent behavior I truly understood. But something inside me had changed. I was no longer afraid of finding out the truth. For so long, I had believed that protecting our marriage meant protecting the image of our marriage. I had spent years making sure everything looked strong from the outside. Now I realized that a relationship could not survive on appearances alone. It needed honesty. It needed respect. It needed two people willing to stand in the same place and face reality together. That afternoon, I decided to revisit the recording from the baby monitor. I had avoided listening again because I already knew how much those words had affected me. But I also knew I could not make decisions based only on a single moment. I needed to understand the full conversation. I sat alone in my home office with a notebook beside me. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The familiar sound of our living room filled the room. Then I heard Thomas's voice again. He sounded relaxed, almost like someone who believed there was no reason to be careful. I listened quietly, writing down the important details. He talked about me as if I was someone outside of the conversation. That was the part that hurt the most. Not just that he was discussing something without me, but that he seemed comfortable making decisions about my life without asking how I felt. I paused the recording several times. I walked to the window. I looked at the backyard where Thomas and I had spent countless summer evenings. I remembered planting flowers together. I remembered conversations that lasted until the sun went down. I remembered believing we understood each other completely. Then I returned to the recording. I needed to know. I needed to stop filling in the missing pieces with my own fears. As the conversation continued, I realized there were things Thomas had been planning that I had never heard about. Nothing about it was simple anymore. It was not just a private conversation. It was a reminder that my husband had created a space where I no longer felt included. That evening, when Thomas came home, I watched him carefully. He smiled and asked about my day. A few months earlier, I would have immediately told him everything. I would have shared my thoughts, my concerns, and my feelings. But this time, I simply said, it was quiet. He looked at me for a moment, almost as if he sensed something was different. "Are you okay?" he asked. I looked at him and thought about all the years we had shared. I thought about the young couple we used to be. I thought about the promises we made. Then I answered honestly, "I am thinking about a lot of things." He nodded but did not ask what those things were. That small moment told me more than I expected. The old Margaret would have filled the silence. She would have explained herself. She would have made it easier for him. But the woman sitting there that evening understood something important. If someone truly wanted to know what was happening in your heart, you should not have to beg them to ask.
I didn't leave because
Later
I
that
stopped
night,
loving my
I
husband.
called Susan again.
I left because I was
I
terrified
told her what
he
I
had
had
already
learned.
stopped loving
She
me.
listened carefully
I never
and then
imagined
said,
those words would...
"Margaret, the hardest part is accepting that someone can love you and still make choices that hurt you." I thought about that for a long time, because maybe that was the truth I had been avoiding. Maybe Thomas did care about me. Maybe there were still good memories between us. But caring about someone did not give you permission to ignore them.
Love was not just about staying.
Love was about considering the other person in every decision. I closed my notebook and placed it in the drawer. I was not ready to confront Thomas yet. I was not ready to make a final decision. But I knew I was no longer the woman standing frozen in the hallway. I was a woman searching for clarity, and this time, I would not stop until I understood the truth. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of patience. I continued living my normal routine, but everything felt different. I prepared breakfast in the morning. I watered the flowers in the afternoon. I folded laundry and kept the house organized, just as I had done for decades. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, I was no longer moving through life without questions. I was paying attention. I was finally listening to the feelings I had ignored for so long. Thomas did not seem to notice the difference in me. That was something I found interesting. He still spoke to me the same way. He still asked simple questions about dinner or weekend plans. He still acted as if our lives were following the same path they had always followed. But I noticed something I had never noticed before. He was comfortable. He believed everything was still under control. One evening, while we were sitting at the kitchen table, Thomas mentioned that he had been thinking about the future. I looked up from my coffee and asked, "What kind of future?" He paused for a moment. It was a small pause, but I noticed it. "Just life in general," he replied. "Things change as we get older." I nodded slowly. He was right. Things did change.
People changed.
Circumstances changed. But I wondered why his thoughts about the future seemed to happen without me. That night, after Thomas went to bed, I opened my notebook again. I wrote down the things I knew. I wrote down the things I had heard. I wrote down the questions I still needed answered. Not because I wanted to build a case against my husband. I wrote because I needed to separate facts from fears. For many years, I had been the person who remembered everything for everyone else. I remembered family birthdays. I remembered important appointments. I remembered the little details that made people feel loved. Now I was doing the same thing for myself. I was collecting pieces of my own story. A few days later, Susan came over for coffee. She brought a small box of pastries from a bakery near her house, just like she always did. That was one thing I appreciated about Susan. She never arrived with dramatic speeches or quick solutions. She simply showed up. We sat at the kitchen table where so many family conversations had happened over the years. I told her that I was afraid of what I might discover. I told her that part of me still hoped there was a simple explanation. Susan looked at me and said, "Margaret, Hoping for the best does not mean ignoring what is right in front of you. I thought about those words. I had spent years believing that being a good wife meant giving people endless chances. But maybe there was a difference between understanding someone and abandoning yourself for them. That evening, I made a decision. I would stop trying to guess what Thomas was thinking. I would stop creating explanations for his actions. If there was something he needed to say it himself. The following weekend, Thomas suggested we have dinner together at home. He seemed unusually cheerful. He talked about ordinary things, the weather, the garden, plans for the upcoming month. I watched him across the table and wondered how many conversations we had shared while he carried thoughts he never expressed to me. When dinner ended, Thomas reached for his coffee and said, "Margaret, I think we should talk about some changes coming in our lives." My heart remained calm. Months earlier, those words might have frightened me, but now I was ready. I looked at him and simply said, "I think we should." For the first time, I was not waiting for him to tell me my place in his plans. I was ready to understand what those plans really were. And whatever I discovered, I knew I would face it with the same strength I had carried through every season of my life. This evening, Thomas wanted to talk about the future arrived quietly. There was no dramatic moment before it began. No warning sign. No obvious change in the atmosphere. Just the two of us sitting at the same kitchen table, where we had shared thousands of meals over the years. The same table where we had celebrated birthdays, opened holiday cards, and talked about our dreams when we were younger. But that night, I felt something different. I was no longer sitting there as the wife who simply waited for her husband to explain. I was sitting there as a woman who had finally started listening to herself. Thomas poured coffee into his cup and looked at me for a moment. "Margaret, I think we need to make some decisions about the next chapter of our lives." I folded my hands on the table and asked, "What kind of decisions?" He looked toward the window before answering. That small movement caught my attention. It was the same habit he had when he avoided difficult conversations. "Things are changing," he said. "We need to think practically." I had heard those words before. Practical, future, changes. They sounded harmless when spoken separately. But together, they felt like pieces of a conversation I had never been invited to join. I remained calm and asked, "Thomas, have you already been making decisions about these changes?" He looked surprised by the question. Only for a second, but it was enough. "Why would you ask that?" he replied. I looked at him carefully, because lately, I feel like I am hearing about our life after choices have already been made. The room became quiet. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the trees. It was a normal evening in every way, and yet it felt like a moment that had been waiting years to happen. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Margaret, you are reading too much into things." That sentence was familiar. I had heard it many times before, but this time, I heard it differently. Before, I would have questioned myself. I would have wondered if I was being too sensitive. I would have apologized for bringing up a concern. But that night, I simply accepted that my feelings were real. "Maybe," I said quietly, "or maybe I am finally paying attention." Thomas looked at me, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty on his face. He was used to the old Margaret, the woman who kept peace, the woman who made things easier, the woman who often chose silence because she believed love required patience. But he was beginning to see that patience did not mean I would ignore myself forever. After a long pause, Thomas said, "There are things you do not understand." I nodded slowly. "Then help me understand." He looked down at his coffee. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell me everything. I thought he might explain the conversation I heard and the reasons behind his actions. But instead, he said, "It is complicated." I almost smiled. Complicated. another word people use when the truth feels difficult to say. I did not push him further that night. I had learned that forcing answers rarely creates honesty. Sometimes, people reveal themselves more clearly when they are given space. After he went to bed, I returned to my home office and opened my notebook. I wrote one sentence at the top of the page. Asked for honesty, not perfection. That was the truth. I was not searching for a flawless husband or a perfect marriage. I was asking for the respect of being included in the life I helped build. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of peace. I still did not know every detail. I still had questions, but I no longer felt powerless. The woman who once stood frozen in the hallway listening to a voice she did not recognize was gone. In her place was someone who understood that knowing the truth might hurt, but living without it would hurt even more. The days after that conversation with Thomas felt different, not because he changed, but because I had changed. I no longer spent every moment trying to understand his silence. I stopped searching for excuses that made his choices easier to accept. Instead, I focused on understanding what I needed and what kind of life I wanted moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to be honest about my own feelings. I had spent years believing that a strong marriage meant carrying difficult moments quietly. I believed commitment meant staying patient even when things became painful. But I was beginning to understand that commitment also required honesty from both people. One afternoon, I received a call from Susan. She asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. We sat at a small cafe near her neighborhood, away from the familiar rooms of my house where so many memories lived. Sometimes a different place helps you see your own situation more clearly. Susan looked at me and said, "Margaret, you seem calmer." I smiled softly and replied, "I think I finally stopped trying to control what I cannot control." She nodded. That is a powerful realization. I looked down at my coffee cup and thought about those words. For weeks, I had been focused on what Thomas was hiding. But I realized there was another question I needed to answer. Who was I becoming through this experience? I did not want to become someone filled with bitterness. I did not want my entire identity to be defined by someone else's choices. I wanted to remain the woman I had always been, but with a stronger understanding of my own value. When I returned home that afternoon, I found Thomas sitting in the living room. He looked up and smiled. "Where were you?" he asked. It was a simple question, but something about it felt different. Maybe because I realized I no longer needed permission to have a life outside of him. "I was having coffee with Susan," I answered. He nodded and returned his attention to the television. A few months earlier, I might have felt hurt that he did not ask more. But this time I noticed something else. I noticed that I was no longer waiting for him to validate my choices. That evening, I made dinner as usual. We sat together quietly. The silence between us was not comfortable, but it was honest. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Margaret, I know you've been thinking about things." I looked at him. "Yes, I have." He took a deep breath. "I know things have felt different lately." I waited. I wanted to hear what he would say next. "I never wanted to hurt you," he continued. I believed that he meant those words. But I also knew that good intentions did not erase the impact of someone's actions. "Thomas," I said calmly, "I do not need you to tell me you never meant to hurt me. I need you to understand why I felt hurt." He looked at me quietly. For the first time, I saw him truly listening, not preparing an explanation, not defending himself, just listening. We talked for a long time that night. There were no perfect answers. There were no simple solutions. But there was finally a conversation where both of us were present. I told him how alone I had felt. I told him how painful it was to realize that important thoughts about our future were being discussed without me. Thomas admitted that he had avoided difficult conversations because he thought he was protecting everyone from stress. But in trying to avoid discomfort, He had created something much worse. He had created distance. When the conversation ended, I walked into my office and looked at the old photographs on the wall. I still loved the memories we had created. I still respected the years we shared. But I also understood something important. Loving someone does not mean losing yourself in the process. The truth had changed our marriage, but it had also changed me. I was no longer the woman waiting for someone else to decide if she mattered. I already knew the answer. Months later, I often thought about the woman I was on that evening when I stood in the hallway listening to words I never expected to hear. She was someone who felt lost. Someone who questioned whether all the years of love, patience, and devotion had truly mattered. But when I looked back now, I realized that moment was not only the beginning of my pain, it was also the beginning of my understanding. I learned that sometimes the hardest moments in life reveal parts of ourselves that we had forgotten. Before everything changed, I believed my greatest responsibility was keeping my family together. I believed love meant always being the person who adjusted, forgave, and understood. But I discovered something important. A family cannot be held together by only one person's effort. A marriage cannot be protected by only one person's honesty. Both people have to choose it. Thomas and I continued having conversations after that night.
Some were easy.
Some were difficult. We talked about the years we spent together and the moments when we stopped truly communicating. We talked about how quickly small distances can grow when people avoid uncomfortable truths. I appreciated that Thomas finally began listening, but I also understood that rebuilding trust would take time. A lifetime of memories cannot erase a painful moment, and one apology cannot repair everything instantly. Real healing requires patience from both sides. I started focusing more on myself. I returned to activities I had set aside over the years. I spent more time in my garden. I met Susan for coffee more often. I started writing again, something I loved when I was younger but had forgotten about while taking care of everyone else. These small choices reminded me that I was more than a wife. I was more than someone's caretaker. I was a person with dreams, thoughts, and a voice that deserved to be heard. One morning, I stood outside with my coffee and looked at the flowers I had planted years earlier. The garden was not perfect. Some flowers had grown unevenly. Some areas needed attention. But it was still beautiful because I had cared for it through every season. I realized my life was much the same. There had been difficult seasons. There had been moments when I felt overlooked. But I was still standing. I was still growing. I was still capable of creating something meaningful. Thomas joined me outside that morning. We stood quietly for a while. Then he said, "Margaret, I know I cannot change what happened, but I want you to know that I understand now." I looked at him and appreciated the honesty in his voice. I did not need him to erase the past. I did not need him to become a different person overnight. I only needed him to finally see me. "That is all I ever wanted," I said. "To know that I mattered." He nodded. The conversation was simple, but it meant something because it came from a place of truth. Looking back, I know I could have chosen anger. I could have allowed one painful discovery to define the rest of my life. But I chose something different. I chose to learn from it. I chose to protect my peace. I chose to remember who I was before I became so focused on everyone else. The house remained the same. The memories remained the same. The years we shared remained part of our story. But I was different. I was no longer afraid of the truth. I was no longer waiting for someone else to tell me my value. I knew it already, and that was the greatest thing I found after everything changed. I found myself again.